Pastor Paul Chappell presented this session, Trends and Truths, at Spiritual Leadership Conference in June of 2018. This is part 7, the trend of ecumenical cooperation.
This, number 4, there is the trend of ecumenical cooperation and collaboration. I believe in collaboration with men of like faith and practice. That's what Baptists have done since the beginning of time. And sometimes young fundamentalists have been discouraged by not seeing better collaboration amongst leaders in our movement. It's been discouraging. I can tell you from this platform that I've invited, in my mind, every major leader in fundamentalism to this conference repeatedly. Some come, some don't, some are going to be here this week. I just believe that there needs to be a visible camaraderie amongst Bible college presidents and leaders and preachers. And I understand the young preacher's heart and desire for that. And sometimes when they get discouraged and they see infighting amongst us and they see what appears to be greater collaboration in other groups, it's attractive to them. But I also want to say that we must be careful of ecumenical cooperation. Remember that we fellowship based upon doctrine and practice. And one of the proponents of this philosophy of missional ecumenical ministry is Southern Baptist teacher Ed Stetzer, who said, you have more of a kingdom mentality. You want to work together with other kingdom partners. Now, he does that. He preaches for the Assemblies of God and for the Methodists and for all of these. And I would just simply say that's not something that I would recommend for someone who desires to be faithful in not giving an uncertain sound. And be careful where that ecumenicism will lead you. In fact, sometimes people will hear me say, well, you better be careful, that came out of Fuller. And they have no idea, well, what's so wrong about that? You know? In fact, a lot of people are more defensive of the other side than of the very place where they were raised. Let's take a listen to what the current president of Fuller Seminary had to say about Mormonism recently.
Evangelicals and Mormons have been really at each other's throats from the very beginning. I got up and I said, this is a great event. We haven't been friends. Friendship is a new thing, and this is a wonderful development. And I want to say as an evangelical that I want to apologize to my Mormon friends because we've often told you what you believe rather than ask you what you believe. We didn't want to get into, how did the Book of Mormon come into being, and was Joseph Smith a genuine prophet of God and all of that. We didn't want to get into the origins of the Book of Mormon. Now, in the early days, Christianity was seen as a cult by the Jews. Right. And Jews no longer think of us as a cult or a sect. And I think we owe the same thing to our Mormon friends.
Ecumenicism. Where does it stop? Fuller Seminary. Brother Chappell, why do you mention we better check where this author's from or trained? Or why does that even matter? Friends, it matters greatly. You better be very careful of the cistern from which you drink, you see. So let me give you a few truths about ecumenical collaboration. For those, even in our movement, who would begin to collaborate perhaps in different realms. Just a couple thoughts. Baptists have historically fellowshipped around faith and practice. Now, I'm happy to stand with any Christian for the good of our country. I would stand with people from other denominations for America, for our freedom, and I believe there's a place for that. But we must avoid an uncertain sound. For if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself to battle? That's why I'm very careful about where I platform. We must separate from those who teach contrary doctrine. Romans 16:17. I beseech you, brethren, mark them which cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which you have learned. If you don't draw those lines, if you're not willing to take that stand, where does it go? You just saw one example of someone who, by the way, calls himself an evangelical, and I would strongly disagree with his self-definition. Thirdly, you must stand with your convictions. I have convictions personally about the preservation of Scripture and alcohol and even worship, and these are convictions that I'm going to stand with. Be careful not to confuse your church. I've learned some people don't like the terms regarding separation. Let me just say, okay, so set those terms aside. Let's just say a good reason to not be there is you don't want to confuse your church by being there. Can two walk together except they be agreed? And by the way, that passage, Amos 3:3, is not in contradiction with Romans 14 because it speaks in Amos 3:3 of a continual walking. It speaks of an abiding relationship. How can you walk with someone who doesn't believe in the preservation of Scripture or the eternal eternal security of the believer, or whatever else. How does that happen without confusing the people that you taught we believed in the preservation of Scripture, or we believed in eternal security? And so we must be very, very careful. And pastors, let me say this, and please hear me. If you have been disappointed by a mentor or by a season of ministry and fundamentalism with an independent Baptist context, be careful about running to an equally flawed leader in another movement. I mean, I've seen people who never on Twitter would quote an independent Baptist or somebody that's from the context of conservatism. And I'm not going to mention names, I'm trying to be kind, but I can tell you the names of 5 prominent men that have in recent days fallen. They've lost their churches. They've had to pay out millions of dollars for sexting scandals and this and for that. And I'm just saying that suddenly someone who was saying, yeah, man, those guys, they don't understand anything. They just beat me down. This is where it's at right here. And you know what they found out? Their new mentor was flawed too. And it becomes a vicious cycle. I wrote about this recently. I said I'm hearing more younger pastors being challenged to follow after us and seek counsel either from their own peers or only Jesus. This counsel actually feeds into the validation trap, perpetuating the cycle from the other side. Here's how it works. A young leader looks to men instead of to Christ for validation and acceptance. For a while, he receives this affirmation, but over time, he finds it was hollow. And with a heart that was somewhat jaded toward his heritage or personalities who disappointed him, he swings the pendulum of counsel to the opposite direction and says, don't follow men, only follow Jesus. What follows is a new cycle of young men still seeking validation and approval just from another set of leaders. It's a vicious cycle. It's a lose-lose. I don't have the time to go through this, but if there was ever a man in this room that had a great disappointment and hurt from a fundamental leader and mentor, looking to someone and seeking approval, and that, by the way, that's not always the leader's fault. We have to take responsibility for that. If someone got burned because they were seeking affirmation, that's not always the leader's fault. Because many times the leader's assuming they're doing it for Jesus. But I remember crying myself to sleep in 1991. I remember a time in my life in ministry when the man that I looked up to the most left the ministry in a very terrible way. And I remember the devil coming up to my ear and saying, hey, Chuck Swindoll didn't do that. So-and-so didn't do that. And for a while just thinking, maybe what I needed to do is just find a new, and if I would have ever left the moorings of my faith, but you know what I had to come to? Being a fundamental Bible-believing Baptist with all of our warts and flaws is more about truth than it is about people. And I just want to say publicly, I'm glad I stayed as an independent Baptist. I'm glad I didn't run off to the other crowd, if you will, and just continue the cycle. Contextualization trends, we need to study them in light of Scripture. Interpretive methods and terms, we need to study them in the light of Scripture. Affirm that which is scriptural and run from that which is humanism.
You can view or download this session in its entirety at slconference.com. For more information about Pastor Paul Chappell, visit paulchappell.com.